Exsecting, Divergent, Unchanged, and Additive fantasy conceits. As we discussed before, fantasy conceits are the things that you change in your world that make it deviate from reality. This is what you're trying to explore, and they fall into four major categories. Exsecting, which is to remove something. Unchanged is in nothing changes. Divergent, which is something is different but mostly the same, and then additive, where you add something. Exsecting is removing something like wood, iron, water, or gravity, things that will change the basic way that the world works. Dark Sun, the role-playing companion for Dungeons & Dragons, was a great example where they didn't have any iron, but I've been told recently that it's been out of print for a long time, so maybe not the best example. Unchanged means that there are no fantasy conceits, that the world is exactly like reality, and this may seem kind of simple, but Tolkien points out that anything that does not fall under a fantasy conceit must abide by the rules of the real world. This is called terra de facto, and things like seasons in fantasy books means that their world is not the same 23 whatever degree tilt that ours is with a single moon, etc., etc. So when you do that, terra de facto and unchanged conceits means that the audience can make sure everything feels normal to them so they can look at the other conceits. For instance, divergent, which means that something happened differently, that evolved a different direction, like a world where cats, were evolved from cats instead of apes. A great example of that is Cars, the movie Cars. I mean, it makes no sense when you actually stop to look at the world building of why do they live this way. That's exactly like our society, but, with sentient cars. A lot of children's books do this, where you have sentient anthropomorphic animals that live just like our society. Doesn't make much sense from a world-building perspective, but if it's what you're examining within the world itself, it's totally normal and fine. Additive is what we normally think of as fantasy conceits, where you add something to the world, be it magic, impossible creatures like dragons or elves, dwarves, etc., etc. That's what we use most of the time by taking something in the real world, or taking our real world and adding something new to it. There's also a fifth one, early adoption, but that one is just for technological fantasy conceits, as in the culture found something like muskets long before their real world analogs did. That can change the world significantly. And I think in Avatar, the original series, the Fire Nation had tanks and that kind of thing long before they did in real world, and same with the catapults, the stingers they used at the end of Game of Thrones. One last thing to remember is that the way the fantasy conceits manifest aren't mutually exclusive, meaning you can have an exsecting, unchanged, divergent, and additive all in the same world. R.J. Barker's Bone Ships is a great example of this. There's no wood, but there are magical creatures, huge water worms that they build their ships out of. So you have an additive of the new creature, as well as the exsecting of removing wood, plus some divergent, and then the reverse sexual dimorphism that affects the culture itself. So there you go. There's the four major ones. This is how most fantasy conceits manifest within the world, and I hope you can use them to do some great world building.